Well, hello, good evening. Welcome back if you've been to some of the earliest seminars in this series, and welcome for the first time if you haven't. So this is this webinar tonight is to report a piece of work we did with funding from LEADER in Swansea, co-funded by EFNCP, and it was carried out by Helen Barnes and myself. So the observant amongst you will realize that this isn't a picture of Swansea, so it's a picture obviously in the Heads of the Valleys area, and we've used this throughout the series of seminars in the different projects to give the message that this is a series of stepping stones towards what we hope will be the implementation of this results-based approach in Wales. So just to reiterate that point, that it is the latest in a long line of projects, some involving ourselves, but going back further, 20 years in some cases. So it's not a new approach, it's an approach that's tested, and it's an approach that's been proved to work in Ireland especially. The Burren and the Arbap's work, and work in parallel with that from IT Sligo. And then more recently work that I've been involved in myself up in Scotland, funded by LEADER in Shigal in the Western Isles and by Nature Scott, and their ProBus exercise that's also happened there. And then latterly in Wales. So first there was a LEADER preparatory project, and that was followed by a full cooperation project lasting 13 months with funding from 6 LEADER areas and from Natural Resources Wales. And subsequent to that, there's been a small project funded by Nis Talbot LEADER. And then this project that we're reporting on tonight, which was a small project funded by Swansea LEADER, as I said. And the aim of the project was to do it for real, as it were, on Fairwood, and we'll get into that later. And I should say that as part of this wider envelope of projects, initiatives, there's been 2 stakeholder visits to Ireland, and we'll come back to that also later on. So this is what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to talk about where we were and when this project was initiated. We're going to give the context for Fairwood itself. We're going to say how we prepared for and delivered the field-based scoring. And we're going to talk a bit, just touch on amendments to the scorecards that came as a result. We're going to look at the scores that we scored there and the implications. How might they be? How might they inform a package of measures? And then we'll just step back and look at some wider developments and hopefully come to some conclusions. So let's just start with where we were in early 2022. So stepping back here, what's the overall aim here? Well, the overall aim is that there's another way of doing agri-environment and associated measures to deliver a package of things to improve public policy outcomes for biodiversity, for water, for carbon, etc. And there's a way of doing it that, as I said, has been tested in other places, which seems to be at least as good as the present one, the traditional one that we've used in Wales, and potentially better, in many circumstances at least, and one that the Irish experience shows gives a much better experience for the participating farmers, and that it does so with more or less the same costs. So not with a hugely inflated costs, and considering the improved results it gives. On this approach, we've had very little experience of it in Wales. It's not no experience. There's been some work, as you may know, by the Clean Partnership and the National Trust and SMS to develop an approach in North Wales. But I think it's fair to say that that's hasn't been really very good at publicizing itself. And certainly there's no indication of interest. There was no indication of interest in early 2022 from the direction of the the policy design, the scheme design team in Welsh Government that was working on the sustainable farming scheme. So our leader cooperation project, we think, had produced a pilot-ready approach, which we were relatively happy with. But on the other hand, it was definitely one that needed piloting. So it was only pilot-ready, it was not full implementation ready. So that's where we were in early 2022. And ringing in our ears was a statement from senior Welsh Government people earlier that there was no way we were going to have a Burren-style results-based scheme in Wales. That wasn't going to happen. That wasn't going to be part of the sustainable farming scheme. And in that context, that's the context in which we have to see the support and the interest of the Swansea local team of NRW. So they've been supportive throughout this series of projects and instrumental in a lot of them in encouraging us and pointing us towards funding. And we went to them when the leader put out a call for small-scale projects and said, well, where can we go? It's not going to go anywhere, so it seems, in Welsh Government, so where can we go? And what they said to us, well, we're in the start of a discussion with a common in Swansea, in Gower, Fairwood. It's one we really want to make a management agreement with. And perhaps this approach could be part of it, alongside capital works or whatever. Perhaps we could have a results-based approach. So why don't we have a project that you do that development work for us, that you do the results-based approach on Fairwood, and then we can incorporate it potentially, if graziers are interested, in our management agreement, if our land agents agree and all sorts of things. But at least the work is done. It's a possibility. And so that's what we did. We put in a small application to Swansea Leader, and we got the fast track grant. And then later on, we got a bit of top-up funding later in the year. So that's the background to the project itself. Now for some background to Fairwood. So for those of you who don't know it, Fairwood is one of the first commons you come to as you drive west from Swansea onto Gower. So there's about 411 hectares within the fence, if we can say it that way. There's some areas of common are out with the cattle grids and are not grazed. So we're concentrating on the grazed area here. It's part of the Gower Commons SSC. So it's a Natura site. It's of European importance. And it's got habitats from Annex 1, wet heath, Molinia Meadows, as they call it, species-rich Molinia grassland, and it's got the Annex 2 butterfly species mass fertility. So it's a very interesting and important site, but it has some real problems. So it's crossed by 3 busy main roads, and there's a history of animals being killed there by traffic accidents, serious number of animals over the years. It also has a serious wildfire issue. Fires every year, I think it's fair to say, maybe multiple fires every year. And in recent years, it's had historically low levels of grazing. And you can see that the issues are related to each other. So roadkill obviously makes grazing less attractive. Other things like TB rules will have an impact also. But then the less grazing there is, the more fuel there is, and the more likely wildfire is, despite the efforts of Swansea Council, who are the owners of the soil here, and others to support the grazing, the mowing of fire breaks. So it's a common with a bit of a Gordian knot to get out of, really. And it's not in Gloucester for various reasons. So obviously it does need some help from somebody to try and get into a different place, as it were. And that's NRW's idea, is how to complement this support for fire breaks, for example, by something which makes the viability of the grazing system a bit better. So those of you that have been to previous webinars or have read some of the reports that we've done will remember that we developed an approach to scoring. We had a methodology that we thought we could use. And I should just say, maybe as an interjection to myself here, unless I say things are different tonight, then everything that's in the previous webinars, you can take as being still true. So most of it still applies, and you can go there for more information on it. And I'll try and concentrate just on things that are different. So one of the things that is different is the approach to surveying a common. So what we originally said, and what had been said in Scotland, and what is said still in Ireland, is that the way to do it is to do a W-shaped walk. And the W-shaped walk will be through patches, blocks on a common, where the vegetation is sort of the same, so that the W gives you a not too much variation when you get the score. And then you add them all together and you get the score for the whole common. And the more we were going to do it in practice, the more difficult that seemed to us. So first of all, we didn't have this vegetation map, which you see on the right here. And so the question of deciding where the blocks were was a bit chicken and egg, really. You needed to survey to go and decide where the blocks were, but if you're doing the survey, then you didn't really want to have to do it again once you decided where the blocks were. And it really is, as you can see in the map on the right, it really is quite a patchwork. And the other thing is that as a former advisor, you know it's really difficult to do something like a W-shaped walk objectively. Really difficult. Because there's always some places that are easier and some places that you don't want to miss out because they look good, and so on. There's a lot of motivations and drivers there that are really not conducive to objectivity. And so what we tried or we decided we would try in Fairwood is to do another approach, which is to use a regular grid. So with a regular grid, you don't have to worry about where you're going to go. The grid tells you that. You don't have to worry about whether it's representative. If you do enough points, then it will be representative. So that's what we did. So I had to a bit of a learning curve here. So we used the free GIS software QGIS to create a grid, and then to create centroids of the grid, and we clipped it using the SSSI boundary, which actually is a better line than the common in this case. And the grid was placed randomly. What happens is you just draw a square on your map, and the grid is placed within the square. So where you put the exact edge of the square, that's just random basically. And if you moved it a bit to the left, then the grid would move to the left. And we think that's a positive thing actually, because it means that there's no temptation to do gardening when you do the next grid for your checkup. Let's say it could be in a totally different place. So that's a positive thing. And we started with the intention of having a 200-meter square grid. And the intention behind that was to have too many points so that we could find out how many points it was we needed. You know, we could take half of them away and see if we got the same answer. Take 2/3 of them away and see if we got the same answer. But the budget in the project was quite modest. And when we started doing the testing, the scoring, we realized that we'd never get through the 200. So that gave us almost 300 points to do, and we just couldn't do it with the budget available. And so rather than start again, because we'd done some points, what we decided was to take out alternate columns of points. And that left us with the grid you see on the right, so 400 meters in one direction and 200 meters in the other, and 134 sample points. And that's what we did. And how it worked in the field was that we had that image that you saw earlier, that's obviously on Google Maps, so we could use Google Maps and Bing Maps to find the places. And the reason I've put the 2 there is that we found, in the case of Fairwood, that the maps were done in different seasons. So it would be easier to find some vegetation distinctions in Bing Maps, let's say, and some other ones in Google Maps. So yeah, I would encourage you, if you are doing it, to look at more than one set of maps. It's actually very handy. But in general, we use Google Maps, and we just looked for bushes, looked for edges of vegetation, and we found that we could actually do it. We didn't need to geolocate ourselves. It wasn't necessary. And in fact, even though Fairwood is quite flat and open to phone signals, you would think, we found that a phone itself, anyway, the geolocation on a phone wasn't good enough to locate us. So perhaps if we had a larger or more featureless site, using a real GPS device, a Garmin or something, maybe that would be something that would be worth doing. But we didn't use it, and I can't say for sure that it would have helped, but I have suspicion it would have done. And then at each spot, what we did was we put a cane in the ground, as you see there, and we assessed a circle with a radius of 10 meters from that spot. And we spent 5 minutes of recording effort doing so. So that's Helen doing it there. And that's what she's doing there, is actually walking in a spiral out from the middle. That we found that to be quite a good way of doing it. To cover all the ground equally. And then we took a photo at each place, north facing, so that it was never sun glare, and always with the pole in the photo. We learned this as we went along. And we recorded it all on a tablet. And we had a new version of the scorecard, which is interactive, so that the computer was doing some of the work as we went along, and we just had to download the line of answers at the end of the process. On some days the phone didn't work or whatever, and we used paper versions. So actually it was just a bit quicker in the field to do the paper version, but the overall process took longer with paper because you then had to input the data in the office, etc. And so we would recommend, I think, only using paper if you had to for technical reasons, or because maybe time in the field was really, really scarce. In that case, it might be worth spending the extra office time to do it. But overall, we found we could do about 20 stops in the day per person. And that's on a common, that's on the one hand close to a road, close to roads, but on the other hand is quite hard going in places. We did it all on foot, so there was no use of quads or anything. So you can see that there's, you'd have some variation around that depending on the common, but that's the order of magnitude of the number of stops you can do. I think it's also true to say that obviously in this picture we're doing a stop together. If we do a stop together, it takes less time, but it doesn't take half the time. And so in general, you're better off doing it on a one-person basis, spreading the effort in different points. So that's how it worked in the field. This is an important point, really, an important question. So this approach that we have, it has to be reliable, it has to be repeatable, but it also has to be meaningful. So how many points do you need for something to be meaningful, for the average that you get to be the average for the common? So to skip ahead here, some of the points we had a score of 7. Some of the points had a score of -4. So if you just take 1 point, obviously that's too few, obviously. And clearly if you take 10,000 points, well, you'll get a good average, but do you really need 10,000 points? Well, probably not. So what number of points do you need? I hoped I'd get an answer to this before we started. I spoke to people that had more ecological training than myself, but I never really got a sensible answer from them. Lots of criteria seemed to be after the event that you could look at the data and then you could say how many you needed. So I just took a layman's approach to try and test that question. So what I did was the points were numbered, so I took them in order. I took the first one, then I took the second one and took the average of the first two. Then I took the first three and took the average, the first four, took the average. And that's what we see in this plot here. So as we go from left to right, we're just adding more points and we're again taking an average. And as you can see, the average sort of settles down as we go into more and more points. But that's just one order that you do it in. So what if you did it another order? Well, I just did it one other way. There's many ways you could order them, but I did the order in reverse. So I started with the bottom one and added one and added two and added three, the same thing. And as you can see, the averages start to converge at some point. And this second half of the plot, really, the average doesn't do much. And remember, we're only giving a score to a precision of 0.5. Yeah, that's the score. That's the only score you can have: 0, 0.5, 1, 1.5, etc. Yeah? And so all this variation is well within 1 unit of scoring. And so what it looks like is that in this case, anyway, everything settles down by about 60 points. And 60 points is the same as 15 points per 100 hectares. And at the rate we were doing it, 60 points would have taken about 3 days to do. And that, by the same token, means that you can do, if the rate that we did them at is representative, you can do around 130 to 140 hectares per day. And I have to say, I found that very gratifying. So it sounds like we could roll this out quite efficiently, quite meaningfully, quite robustly, with really a fairly low level of effort, actually, which is exactly, of course, what you need for a system which can be widely used. So we're not clear, of course, how this might vary. We're not. But on the other hand, Fairwood is a really variable place. There's a lot of different habitats there, habitats in different conditions there. So I would hope, I think, that we won't find circumstances where it's much less robust at this low level of scoring, although you can imagine that there are circumstances where it might be the case. So maybe cliff vegetation or something that's very heterogeneous. I don't know, but that's in general, I think it's a good message. It's a good result we've got. We had the chance, of course, in doing it properly, to really get into the scorecards and its pitfalls. And we also had some input from NRW. So we had Dan Guest from the monitoring team. He came out. That was really useful. And he made some comments. And so there's been some amendments to the scorecard just on the basis of the Fairwood work. So one of the things we did, you'll remember if you're familiar with the scorecard, that we ask about indicator species in terms of present, frequent, and abundant. But we hadn't got any definitions for that. Well, now we have some draft definitions, and we're using a different criterion for plants that are short and plants that are tall, on the basis that let's say 10 hogweed plants would be really dominating in the 10-meter radius square, but 10 eyebright plants, you wouldn't see them almost, they'd be really insignificant. So we've done that. We've brought in a sphagnum question into the wet heath question. This was Dan's suggestion, and that makes sense completely. We've tightened up on the scoring of areas of over 50% Molinia, so that it's much more closely tied to evidence of grazing. And that's for two reasons, one of which we've got here really, which is that if you've done some mowing, then obviously there's going to be a period when the structure, in terms of height at least, looks not too bad. But it's only going to be at that point for a short time, and then it's all going to be rank. That's the one thing. And then the other thing, of course, is that we're assuming that mowing will be paid for somehow by a capital works payment. And what we're trying to pay for with our payment is grazing, the cost of grazing. And so that's a better, it's a distinction that's meaningful in terms of what we're paying for. So we've done that. And then the last thing is that we've removed the encouragement for natural regen on dry habitats, other than for dense bracken and scrub. I think it's fair to say that this question of natural regeneration and where it's appropriate in terms of other priority habitats, that's the most difficult issue we faced, most difficult to get consensus on. And the one, as I'll come back to later, where I think there's most variation from place to place in Wales, depending on those habitats and the context that it's in, which is quite interesting, especially in the context, of course, of Welsh Government's desire to have more trees in general. Excuse me. So what did we find? Well, the habitats, the mix of habitats is what we see on the left there. So if you remember from our scorecard, our habitat distinctions are just based on what you see. They're not trying to ascribe things to some theoretical habitat or whatever. They're just what you see. And what you see on Fairwood is that more than half of the area is dominated by areas of Molinia with over 50% Molinia. Excuse me. And the rest of the area is divided between wet mosaics, so which is the blue on the bottom left there, dry mosaics, which is the brown, dense bracken and gorse, which is the light blue, and then there's some areas of woodland and very, very small areas, only one spot, in fact, of bog, and one where there was jointed rushes were dominant. And if we have to summarize the habitats, well, the woodland was in good condition by our criteria, at least. The bog, although tiny, only one place, was really good. But most of the habitats were heavily impacted by fire, and or by lack of grazing, and or by invasive species, so invasive brambles especially. So the Molinia area was mostly species poor. There was very few signs of grazing in it, even in some of the mown areas. But there was tiny areas that we came across that showed what it could be like, which were really species rich, with really nice species in it, in them, but they were really, really a tiny minority of the area, and actually none of them fell into any of our scorecard, into any of our sample points. And then the wet and the dry mosaics, well, they're sort of similar, but both of them have some few places where there was really good scores, really high species density. And then when it comes to the bracken and gorse, as I said, those were very difficult to assess from a conceptual point of view. A lot of them, there was some regen there, which we encouraged. But very often that was also accompanied by dense brambles, which the card is discouraging. So yeah, it would be good to be able to iron this out in our heads, but maybe that's not possible. And what we found was that trees were encroaching on almost all the other habitats, at least some places. So on the Molinia area, on the wet mosaics, and on the dry habitats. So this is just an example, a view from one of the points. And you can see in the background some woodland, but also some places where there's woodland clearly spreading out onto other habitats, including some priority habitats. But the area in the foreground is Molinia that's been burnt. So you can see it's very even in age. And you have to take it from me, but there's very, very little sign of grazing there. And there's very few species there. You had some places where there was just one indicator species, but maybe it was tormentil or whatever. So very low scoring places. So talking about scores, this is the distribution of scores. That's the distribution on the right of the actual scores. And this is the diagram, frequency diagram of scores and stops. And you can see there is a spread. We had quite a few negative scores. So where there was no grazing, very few species and encroaching vegetation. So, nothing positive much to say about it. And then we had a very few areas where there was high scores, so high species density or woodland that was in nice condition. But most areas were, had low to medium scores at best. And the average we got actually was 0.6 something, which we're thinking we should probably round up to the nearest 0.5, so one at best. The scores did vary to some extent by habitat. So you can see that the Molinia was particularly bad. And the dense bracken and gorse was also bad, mostly because there was brambles spreading in it and through it and from it. And the woodland, on the other hand, that was mostly good scores. And then the wet and dry mosaics was quite variable. So in some cases there was a number of species present, but then in many cases also there was a lack of grazing or signs of encroachment by brambles and whatever. So it was a mixed picture, but not a particularly positive one. So of course the cards aren't supposed to just tell you what things are like. They're supposed to give you some incentive for improving them and some signal of how you can do it in an achievable way, not just some cloud cuckoo carrot that you'll never reach sort of way. And so what we did an exercise. We looked at all the stops and worked out what decrease in score was related to things that the graziers could do something about. So not the species score, which they can't really change. It might change over time, but they can't really change it. But we're talking of things like vegetation structure, encroaching vegetation, which they can go and tackle, or maybe controversially, the presence of trees. And this is what we found. We found that, okay, there was, well, what is that, 18 stops where nothing could be done, 17 stops where nothing could be done. But most of the rest of them, so 110 or whatever it is that's left, we could do something. You could do something as a grazier to increase your score. And in fact, for some of them, you could increase your score by a large amount, 8 points even. And this is the distribution curve of what we think is possible just by doing things that graziers can influence. And the net result of doing that, using our scorecard and our payment calculation, is an increase in payments per year, excuse me, of over £11,000. So it's not nothing, but whether it's enough to get the action going is really very doubtful, because we're talking about some expensive things here. And this is £11,000. That's down the road. It's not something that's going to happen immediately. It's going to happen after 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 years' time. So we're not saying, of course, just to reiterate our point we've made before, we're not saying that the area payment is the only tool in the box. It's just part of the tools here. It's complementing capital works especially. So this is how the score improvement is distributed between the habitat types on the left. You can see that the bog is just fine. And the woodland, okay, there's some potential in the woodland for doing a change, but most of the potential, actually, because they are the ones that occupy the largest areas, is on the Molinia and on these other ones that are have been subject to fire in the past, but they're subject to encroaching vegetation, as we said, and low indications of grazing. So what we've got in the right is another way of looking at things. So the top one, which is maybe covered by my name, so apologies for that. The top one is the number of stops. So how many stops are there where these three different elements would contribute to an increase in score? And you see that in that one, it looks like improved vegetation structure is the main thing to do, followed by the control of expanding species. So in terms of area impacted, and perhaps not surprising, it's things like mowing and following up grazing, which are going to make a difference. But in terms of the difference it makes to the money that's received if the score goes up, we find that the pattern is a bit different. So in this case, it's the control of expanding species, which, even though it's on a smaller area, gives you the better return, well, potentially income anyway, in terms of money. With improved vegetation structure coming second still, but much less. And so you can see that when we speak to graziers, when graziers are thinking about this, there's going to be a cost benefit process, isn't there? Where they think, well, what does improved vegetation structure cost compared to the benefit? And what does scrub bashing or bracken control, or not bracken control, bramble control or gorse control, what does that cost compared to the benefits? And they're going to come to some sort of conclusion, and we don't know yet what that would be. That's something, yeah, this is just something to feed into their thinking process, their deliberations. But it's quite interesting, I think. So what about the payments? So again, those of you who've been to these webinars before would be familiar with this. So we have a graph here, or a line that's anchored in two places. So at the lowest score of 0.5, we've anchored it at the BPS payment rate, on the assumption that BPS is paying for the maintenance of a winter soil cover, the current carbon store in the vegetation, whatever current biodiversity there is there. Yeah, the BPS is doing something, and we're assuming that even the lowest paid deserves some BPS, because that's what BPS is actually being paid on it. So that's the first anchor. And the second anchor is that we reckon that a good heathland, wet heathland or dry heathland, needs 0.3 livestock units per hectare on average, let's say. And we've estimated the cost of it in ways that we've described in other presentations and in the report. And we're saying, well, let's assume that that's a score of 5. So a good heath will get a score of 5. We know that there's good limestone pastures, whatever, will get a higher score. But let's say that that's the commonest circumstances that places on commons are working towards, is a good heathland. So let's say that has a score of 5, and that leads to this line. Now, our common in Fairwood is getting an average of 0.6, so maybe we say it's 1. We're not saying that doesn't deserve substantial amount of money. In fact, the graph there is saying, well, it deserves 130, 140 pounds per hectare. That's the cost of delivering that. It's less than the cost of delivering that, in fact, but that's what we're saying that they should be paid as part of this mechanism. But of course, we have to take out what BPS is paying them. And BPS is paying that green line there. And so the result of the current situation is that at the score they have now, the income from the area payment would be really quite limited. And that this 11,000 or more that we talked about from the increase of score would be an 11,000 compared to, let's say, 1,000. Okay, which is quite a difference, but that's not going to pay for the costs of doing what needs to be done. So as I say there, if BPS is available, payments would be small. And so it's very clear that all participants that are less than 5, at very least, probably the other ones, would need complementary support. And in fact, in Fairwood, it's going to start from the complementary support end of things, isn't it? That's where the main deliberations on the part of graziers will start. What help can you give us to do these capital actions? And then, of course, over the years, you hope that the area payment would kick in. And that actually reminds us of how the Burren started. The Burren started with capital works, and the area payments came in later to complement them. So it's not a totally fresh situation, but certainly it's one that needs to be treated with some care here, how you put it forward. So what would those complementary supports involve? Well, in this case, there's been work done by Pont as part of a wider report for NRW, and things that are mentioned there are not only the obvious things like support for mowing, and that mowing is not just for fire breaks, but it would need some mowing to increase access to some areas, I think, and support for control of encroaching vegetation, and support for cattle collars. There's some of that is happening already. There's a herd of cattle with no fence collars there, but also support for specific infrastructure. So places where a bridge would help to cross a stream for cattle, for example, that kind of thing. So that's already been thought of, and that will be part of the discussion with graziers. And of course, that is grist to the mill for NRW management agreements. And just to make the point that in our proposals originally, we said, well, area payments, they must have some transaction cost in them because, graziers working together has a cost. But then it's equally, it struck us now that if you have mainly complementary actions, you also need transaction costs there because the same factors are at play. So that's an extra point that we hadn't really pressed before. Just before we leave Fairwood, just to make the point that there are some additional considerations potentially here in the area of fire risk management. So the work that we've done, it has a certain scale. So within the 314 square meters of each assessment plot, we do have some consideration of structure. And that has some relationship to fuel load, so the amount of fuel load and also the connectivity of it. But that's a really small scale, really. And we're not really, at this point, considering the connectivity of fuel load at the landscape scale. And that's something that really clearly matters for fire risk management. And it's a spatial element that is shared by some other things, I think. But it's not something that we're taking account of just now. So on the one hand, you could say, well, fire breaks, they need to be based on a plan. If there isn't one, if there wasn't one, then they would need to be funded, and perhaps that could be something that's part of the complementary actions. But still, the scorecard isn't encouraging it, really. It's just something that works in parallel. And I don't have an answer to this, so I am having discussions with fire experts about it. But just to note that one approach taken in France, for example, is to prioritize or incentivize action in certain key areas above others. So that could mean a higher payment rate, or it could mean that help in kind, which is already being delivered by the council, for example, and by the fire service in other places, or by NRW management agreement in other places, that help in kind is more easily available or only available in certain areas. So there's ways of doing it, I think, but they need to be thought through. So what does, how does an area payment complement such targeted actions? That's something, again, that you could learn lessons from France, for example. And it's something I think we need to think of when we're talking about applying such cards in a wider, in the wider countryside, to achieve, you know, a wider range of policy goals more effectively. So what about the response to graziers? Well, I can't tell you, because we haven't met them yet properly. We're meeting them this Wednesday. So it'll be interesting to see what they say. The one thing, of course, is because they're not in Gloucester, any money is new money. So that's a positive thing, but whether they see it possible to, you know, to overcome the social and transactional costs, which they undoubtedly are, to sign up to something like this, it'll be quite interesting to see. So just some conclusions on the Fairwood work then. So I think that the Fairwood work is a step change from what we've done before, in that it's shown, I think, unambiguously that the results-based approach can be implemented without huge human resources. Obviously, you need some training and capacity or whatever, but you can do a lot with a small amount of manpower, which means that it has the potential for rollout on very large areas, and still be meaningful and still be auditable, and all these things that policy quite rightly cares about. I think the card, we've shown the card to be workable, even though it's still being improved. But I would be quite happy to recommend the card to other people now, albeit not to use it with your eyes closed. Actually, the Excel approach that we used is also quite workable, even though it's, yeah, it's built by amateurs, really. But I would say that the back office stage of it needs to be much more efficient. So, for example, converting the scores we've got, where we can put them in a table, that's not a problem, but converting that table then back into the map of scores that I showed you earlier on, that was really horrendous. I really didn't enjoy that at all. And there must be ways of doing it. And if you're thinking about doing it more widely, of course, then you would want to have links to a JS system. You'd want to have compatibility with RPW or whoever it was that was paying there. So there's all sorts of back office things that need to be worked on, but the front end is surprisingly workable. And yeah, it is surprisingly workable. I was quite pleased with it really, and if it was a small project or a small site, it's more than good enough. And the last point is a very, very important point, that area and capital payments must be complementary. They can't be separate. And that's especially true in low scoring cases like Fairwood. So the area payment has great potential there. I mean, if you see the really good areas, even in the Molinia, the really species rich, they would get really good scores. But that's a long, long way down the line. And there must be some accompanying measures to bring graziers along to that point. And capital works are the obvious main ones. But others may be necessary also, including, it's not impossible, action-based ones. So that's the Fairwood conclusions. But before I finish, I want to just talk about some other developments. So as you'll recall from other presentations, the card isn't just meant for Fairwood. It's meant to be appropriate to well, in principle, any common in Wales. And if it's appropriate for any common in Wales, then that means it's likely appropriate for lots of other land in Wales, which is not common, whether it's mountain land or lowland heath or limestone pastures, all sorts, in fact. That's the aim of the card. That's the aspiration of the card. Yeah? But we know that there's some elements of it are poorly refined and others that need better refining for particular cases. So for the poorly refined end of things, the salt mash element of it is pretty skeletal just now. And it's skeletal because the guidance in Glastir is skeletal. And because when we did it, first of all, we couldn't find anything online to better guide us. But since then, I've found the condition standard monitoring criteria for SSCs, salt mash SSCs. So started to improve that. And as part of that, we've been having discussions with NRW salt mash specialists. So we had a really good discussion online, and we'll be meeting them in the field in January. So the salt mash bit hopefully will be much, much better after that. And then there's some cases here where the card, not the card is wrong, but the card needs just adjustment for certain species. And it's quite interesting actually that the three, I should have put them in all together in the list here, but the three cases that I cite there are all things where the element that needs changing on the card anyway is how you approach scrub in different habitats and whatever, but it's how you approach scrub, whether you are more favorable to scrub as you might be from the black game end of things, or whether you're less tolerant to scrub as you are particularly with curlew. And in the case of pearl bordered, you're somewhere in the middle, so you don't mind a bit of scrub, but you certainly don't want there to be regeneration and invasion by brambles and so on. So that's really interesting. And it says to me that you'd have to have variations on the card for particular sites, but they're only minor variations, really. They're only variations to small elements of it. And the other thing you would need to do is to adjust what complementary actions you offered in different places. So as an extreme case, maybe in the case of curlew, you would want to reward people for chopping down shelter belts, let's say, where predators could perch. Or you might encourage the mowing of areas of rushes, which maybe in other places you'd think, well, that would be rather a waste of money. Just as an example, that may not even be a correct example. But these kind of refinements, they're quite minor, really. That's another thing that's quite gratifying, that there seems to be an applicability here, which is really quite good for these different cases. So that's on the card. And then the second thing takes us back to the slide where we were talking about where we were in early 2022. So if you remember, there was very little enthusiasm in any official circle in Wales or in any NGO circle for this approach, with the possible exception of the Pont colleagues in North Wales who had been working with the LEAD partnership. But overall, very low awareness and very little interest in it. And Welsh Government, of course, had previously said that they weren't interested in it. And before COVID, the NRW Swansea team had got some funding to pay for a study visit to Ireland. So the intention originally had been that we would go there with farmers from the LEADER cooperation project as a kickoff, really, an inspiration to start them off before this project started. But then, of course, COVID came and we couldn't go, but the money was still there implement the trip. And so what we decided to do was to take a very different group of people over. So to take policymakers, policy implementers, policy influencers in NGOs, and farmers, and of course, those aren't all mutually exclusive categories. And we took a group over in May to Ireland. Those 8 of us went. And I think it's true to say that people were really impressed. We went to see, we went to see 4 projects, 4 results-based projects, and some of us went to see another one on the way back. And it was really successful. People came away thinking that there was potential there, that there was interest there, that this could be part of the sustainable farming scheme in some way, but of course that there was a lot of questions to be asked, a lot of other aspects of sustainable farming scheme that needed to be got right, and so forth. And when that group came back, then I think they felt what I felt before the trip, in that you'd seen something and people couldn't understand why you were so enthusiastic about it. And so, cut a long story short, we got another wodge of funding, this time from the Gower AOMB, Sustainable Development Fund, and we took a second group over. This time there was 14 of us went. We went in September, and we went to mostly the same projects, not all the same projects, and again the same result. So I think, well, it's potentially these visits have been a game changer, I think, and there's certainly live interest now in the possibilities of this approach, in some way at least, in both the sustainable farming scheme development team and in parts of NRW. And so what's the next step? I said before that the thing was pilotable but needed to be piloted, and that's, I think, still my view, despite the success of the effort in Fairwood this year. So we're trying to think how to take it forward, how to go the next step in this series of stepping stones, given the lack of a significant budget for trialling in the SFS team, as I understand it anyway, pre-2025. And my concern is particularly high for commons, because separating out some universal actions for commons is, well nigh impossible, I would say. But if we don't do that, and if BPS starts to drop, then where's the funding going to come from? If they can't apply for a universal element, and if they can apply for it, then the danger is that we create a new status quo where money again can go to people who are inactive on the common. So the common thing is a particular focus of attention still on my part, but the question is wider, how to trial things. There's other places other than commons that the approach has potential. And we did put in for Nature Networks funding for a project on 3 SACs in Gower, but the feedback was that there wasn't enough focus on those people in the cities who are disengaged from nature, which is fine. But if this Nature Networks funding is the main biodiversity vehicle for NRW, then there may be lessons to learn from that sort of feedback. And so now we're thinking about the soon to be announced integrated natural resources scheme. This is the son of the sustainable management scheme. So we're thinking about the potential to trial something under that hat, put in an application. We're not saying it's the ideal vehicle or whatever, but if it's the only game in town, then we have to apply for it. And with a view to that, I've been speaking to non-glacial commons of different types around Wales, speaking to graziers, speaking in some cases to stakeholders that are interested in things that are there, trying to see if we can prepare ourselves for the call when it comes. And then on the Welsh Government side, it's completely different now from what it was in April earlier this year. So now there is interest in it. It's not clear how it'll pan out or what it'll mean, but at least there's interest there. And so there's working groups on results-based payments just getting started, and on commons they're getting started. So we're feeding into that. And on Fairwood itself, well, we hope to get something implemented somehow, whether it's through a pilot or whether it's through sustainable farming scheme eventually, whether it's through a management agreement with NRW. So hopefully there'll be something there at least to take things forward. And it's quite gratifying also that just in this last few weeks, there's been wider discussions going on within NRW about how to get discussion about the practicalities of it, how it conforms to their internal rules, to what land agents expect, and so on. So it's not going to be easy, but it's happening, and it's a very, very positive development. So that's where we are. Quite a different place to what we were even 8 months ago. So thanks very much to my colleague Helen Barnes for putting up with me during the work. Thanks to Swansea Leader for funding it, and to the Swansea team of NRW for being supportive as they have been throughout. And so the last thing to say is, well, thank you again for watching, and that the video of tonight, as you'll know if you're already watching it on YouTube, will be on the YouTube EFNCP channel. And the reports, well, of this element of the project, it hasn't been written yet fully, but it will be on the EFNCP website, and we'll also refer to it on the Facebook page for results-based payments in Wales, which I forgot to put on that list. But if you go to Facebook and put results-based payment in Wales, you should get to it. So there'll be links there. So thank you very much. And with that, we'll bring the meeting to a close. Thank you.